They laughed at me on TikTok, not strangers, my family. My sister zoomed in on my thrift store dress and said, "She can't even afford designer for the awards." My brother pinned his comment underneath right where everyone could see it. The poor relative. My parents liked the video, both of them, within minutes. No one told them to stop. No one said it went too far. No one stood up for me. By morning, the video had crossed 1 million views, and I said nothing. 2 days later at my dad's company awards dinner, they sat front and center, smiling like royalty. Perfect posture, perfect clothes, perfect laughter for important people. They looked like a family who had everything figured out. I walked up to their table and said, "Welcome to my restaurant. We only serve real VIPs." The room froze. My mom's smile vanished. Her glass tilted in her hand, and for one long second, I thought she might drop it onto the white tablecloth. That pause is what everyone remembers. The silence. The way the air shifted like the entire room had taken a breath and forgotten how to exhale. But this didn't start there. It started years earlier in a house where I learned how to be quiet without disappearing and how to disappear without anyone noticing I was gone. In my family, silence was my specialty, not because I had nothing to say, but because my words were never worth much to them. My parents were proud people, proud of how things looked, proud of being seen as successful, proud of a version of family life they had carefully built for other people to admire. My brother fit into that picture perfectly. He learned early how to say the right things, laugh at the right moments, shake hands with the right people. My sister learned how to be seen. Cameras loved her. Social media algorithms pushed her content to millions. Attention followed her everywhere she went. I learned how to be useful. I was the one who remembered everyone's birthdays without being reminded. I booked the flights. I showed up early to help set up and stayed late to clean. I was the one who didn't need introductions at family gatherings because nobody asked who I was anyway. At holidays, relatives asked my brother about his promotions and my sister about her follower counts. When they turned to me, the questions were always vague. "Still doing that thing?" they would ask, waving their hands like my entire life could be summarized with a gesture. I learned to smile and nod. It was easier that way. When my sister started filming everything, we all pretended it was harmless. "Just content," she would say, waving her phone around like it was a toy instead of a weapon. She filmed meals, outfits, conversations, edited into jokes. If someone complained, she laughed it off. If someone looked uncomfortable, she called them too sensitive. My parents loved the attention she brought to the family. They shared her videos in group chats and bragged about her reach to their friends. My brother added jokes in the comments that always got likes because people expected him to be funny. I stayed out of frame whenever I could. The night of the video, we had gathered for what my mother called a low-key family dinner. That meant good lighting and enough wine to make everyone forget their boundaries. I wore a dress I had found at a secondhand shop because I liked the color and it fit well. I didn't think about labels. I never had. Fashion was never something I cared about proving to anyone. The camera appeared without warning. My sister's voice lifted bright and fake, the way it always sounded when she was performing for her audience. "Okay, quick fit check," she announced, and I knew without looking that she had pointed the lens at me. She never asked permission. She never had to. I heard my name before I saw myself on the screen. The zoom was slow and deliberate, like a spotlight searching for its target. She laughed. Her words came out polished, ready for engagement. "She can't even afford designer for the awards." My brother's comment appeared almost immediately pinned where everyone could see it. The poor relative. My parents' likes followed within minutes, two small icons that felt heavier than any insult. I waited for someone to pause, for someone to correct her, for a single voice to say, "That's enough." Nothing came. By morning, the video had crossed into territory where it no longer belonged to our family. Strangers stitched it. They slowed it down and added captions. Some people defended me. Most didn't. The cruelty wasn't creative. It didn't need to be. It was familiar and efficient, the kind that spreads because permission has already been granted. My phone buzzed all day with notifications I didn't open. I went to work. I answered emails. I made decisions that affected other people's schedules and careers. I didn't comment on the video. I didn't call my family to ask for an explanation that would never come. Silence, when you choose it deliberately, becomes a strategy. 2 days later, my father's company hosted its annual awards dinner. It was the kind of event that pretended to be about gratitude while quietly ranking everyone in attendance. Invitations were valuable. Seating arrangements were political. My parents treated it like a coronation. My brother had practiced his networking laugh. My sister had planned her social media posts down to the minute. No one asked if I was coming. They assumed I would show up because I always did, the reliable one, the forgettable one, the one who could be counted on to fill a seat without causing any trouble. The venue hummed with energy when I arrived. Staff moved with practiced efficiency. Guests greeted each other with smiles that calculated their return on investment. My family was already there, exactly where they expected to be, front and center, visible, validated. My sister held her phone just low enough to suggest she might go live at any moment. My parents beamed at everyone who walked past. My brother leaned back in his chair, comfortable in a space he believed was built for people exactly like him. I watched them for a moment before I moved forward. Not because I was afraid, because timing matters. When I spoke, my voice didn't carry anger. It carried certainty. "Welcome to my restaurant," I said, and the words landed softly but impossibly loud at the same time. "We only serve real VIPs." Confusion flickered across faces trained to hide it. My mother's smile collapsed. Her hand tightened around her glass until I thought the stem might snap. The room didn't gasp. It didn't laugh. It waited. That pause wasn't surprise. It was recognition struggling to surface. I didn't explain. Explanations invite arguments. I didn't look for their approval. Approval implies doubt. I let the moment exist exactly as it was, undeniable, undecorated. Before that night, my family had a story they told about me. Quiet, simple, safe. The kind of person you don't have to worry about because she'll never outgrow the space you give her. They mistook my boundaries for absence. They mistook my silence for permission. They mistook my refusal to perform for a lack of substance. They weren't cruel on purpose. That would have been easier to forgive. They were comfortable. And comfort breeds the kind of carelessness that doesn't recognize itself as cruelty. Long before the video, long before this dinner, I learned that dignity doesn't announce itself. It waits. It builds. It shows up when called not to impress anyone, but to set the record straight. That night wasn't about revenge in the way people usually mean it. It was about alignment, about the relief of no longer shrinking myself to fit a version that made other people feel superior. It was about letting the truth stand on its own without decoration. I didn't come to take anything from them. I came to stop giving something away. As the room began to move again, as servers resumed their paths and conversations restarted with a different energy underneath, I stepped back, not to retreat, to let the moment complete itself. The story had shifted, not because I raised my voice, but because I lowered my tolerance. Behind me, my family sat in a silence they had never practiced. Ahead of me, the evening continued, indifferent to who had liked what video, who had laughed, who had stayed quiet when it mattered. That was the first time I truly understood something. Being underestimated is only a disadvantage if you believe it yourself. The morning after the video crossed 1 million views, my sister didn't delete it. She turned off the comments like closing a door while leaving the mess inside for someone else to deal with. The clip stayed pinned at the top of her page, frozen in its smirk, the caption unchanged. That choice told me everything I needed to know about how she saw the situation. If she had felt ashamed, she would have erased it. If she had felt sorry, she would have called. Instead, she optimized for engagement. My phone buzzed with a private message from my brother before I finished my coffee. "Don't make this bigger than it is," he wrote. "People are talking. It could affect the family." The words landed exactly where they were meant to land. Not on my feelings, but on my sense of obligation. I didn't answer. An hour later, my parents called in quick succession, like runners passing a baton. Neither asked if I was okay. They asked if I had spoken to anyone about the video. They asked if I planned to respond publicly. They asked if I understood how close we were to an important event, and how distractions had a way of spiraling out of control. It was impressive, really, how efficiently concern could be rerouted into risk management. By the time both calls ended, the message was clear. The problem wasn't what happened to me. The problem was how visible it had become. The awards dinner arrived in every conversation like a guest of honor. My parents spoke about it with reverence, the way people talk about a night they believe will confirm everything they've been telling themselves. My father mentioned the guest list repeatedly, emphasizing the word exclusive, like it was a credential he could wear on his jacket. My mother talked about the lighting and the menu and how the room would photograph. My brother practiced stories out loud, trimming them to their most flattering versions. My sister spoke in hashtags, mapping out posts before the evening even existed. In all of it, I was an absence that didn't register as missing. No one asked where I would sit. No one asked if I wanted to bring anyone. No one asked anything that might complicate the narrative they were polishing. In my family, the awards dinner wasn't just a meal, it was a diagram. There was a right place to be, and there were places that didn't matter. The table at the center carried a weight that went beyond location. It meant you were seen. It meant you belonged to the story being told that night. My brother belonged there automatically, his career tied neatly to my father's legacy. My sister belonged there because she understood spectacle, because she could turn any angle into proof of relevance. I belonged somewhere else, wherever that happened to be. Not excluded exactly, just unassigned. I had seen this diagram drawn and redrawn across years of family gatherings. At company parties, my brother stood near my father, introduced as the future of the family business. My sister floated nearby, camera ready, capturing the glow of recognition. I drifted at the edges, holding a glass, nodding through conversations that ended before they began. When seating charts appeared, there was always a pause at my name, a soft laugh, a suggestion that I could sit anywhere. It was never framed as rejection. It was framed as flexibility. "You're easy," my mother used to say, like that was a compliment. "You don't mind." I minded. I just learned early that minding out loud changed nothing. 2 days after the video, my father called again. His tone was brisk and managerial. He didn't mention TikTok. He didn't mention the comments or the likes, or the way my sister's clip had been stitched into dozens of cruel variations by strangers. He talked about logistics. The awards dinner was coming up fast. It would look strange if I didn't attend. People would ask questions. His voice dropped when he said that, as if questions themselves were dangerous. I told him I planned to come. There was a pause, the kind that follows unexpected cooperation. "Good," he said, and I heard relief slip through. "Keep it simple. Don't make it about you." I almost laughed. The assumption was buried so deep it sounded natural. Everything was already about them. My job was to make sure it stayed that way. After the call, I sat with the quiet and noticed something I hadn't before. The quiet wasn't empty. It was deliberate. They thought my silence meant agreement. They thought my history of not pushing back guaranteed the same outcome forever. They were wrong about one thing, at least. Silence, when chosen carefully, is not consent. It's preparation. I didn't argue with anyone that week. I didn't ask for apologies that would arrive hollow and rehearsed. I didn't explain how it felt to watch strangers debate my worth while my family managed the fallout like a public relations problem. I opened my calendar and made a call they didn't know about. Then another. I confirmed details that had nothing to do with where I would sit and everything to do with how the night would actually run. I listened more than I spoke. I thanked people who didn't need convincing. I kept my voice steady. Nothing about it felt dramatic. It felt like paperwork. And that I realized was exactly how real power preferred to move, quietly, administratively, without asking for applause. In the days before the dinner, my family's excitement grew louder. A seating preview appeared in the group chat, a blurry photo of a printed layout with names too small to read clearly. My sister circled the center with a heart emoji. My brother joked about finally being able to hear himself think at a proper table. My mother reminded everyone to arrive early for photos. I scrolled past it all without responding. They took my silence as confirmation. They always did. The night unfolded with the precision of a ritual. The room filled the way rooms like that always fill, with people greeting each other by titles with laughter calibrated to carry just far enough. My family moved as a unit toward the center, drawn by instinct as much as invitation. They took their seats and settled into the attention they assumed would follow. My sister angled her phone. My brother adjusted his jacket. My parents leaned into each other with the satisfaction of a plan coming together. I arrived separately. Not late, not early. On time in a way that didn't announce itself. I spoke to someone who recognized me immediately and waited where I was asked to wait. From there, I could see my family clearly. They didn't see me. They were too busy being seen. When my sister glanced at the seating chart again, she laughed. "At least not everyone has to be up front," she said, as if sharing a private joke with the air around her. My brother nodded, already half-turned toward a conversation he expected to be part of. My parents smiled the kind of smile that believed itself earned. I watched them with a calm that surprised me. For years I had wondered what it would feel like to stop wanting a place I had never been offered. The answer was simple. It felt like clarity. They thought the center was a reward, proof they had been chosen. I knew better. The center was a stage, and stages have a way of exposing the people who assume they own them. I didn't move yet. There was no rush. Timing matters, and the room wasn't ready. As servers passed and conversations braided together, I let the evening settle into the shape my family expected. They thought they were exactly where they belonged. They had no idea how temporary belonging could be. When I finally stood, it wasn't to claim a seat. It was with the understanding that seats could be reassigned. The difference mattered. As I took my first step forward, I caught my sister's eye for half a second. Her smile flickered. Not because she recognized anything specific, because something in the room had shifted and she didn't know why. They thought the golden table was a prize. I knew it was a spotlight. And spotlights, when they turn, reveal everything. They never knew what I did for a living. Not because I hid it, but because they never thought to ask. Whenever my name came up with relatives or family friends, my parents used the same vague phrases delivered with a practiced smile. "She works in service. She does some kind of management thing." It sounded harmless, almost generous, like they were sparing everyone the trouble of details. The truth was simpler. Details require curiosity, and curiosity had never been extended in my direction. At family dinners, questions moved in predictable circles. My brother was asked about growth projections and next steps in the company. My sister was asked about Reach Collaboration's brand deals. When someone turned toward me, it was usually to ask if I wanted more water or whether I was still living in the same apartment. If I started to answer beyond the surface, the moment passed. Someone interrupted. Someone redirected. The conversation found its way back to safer ground, and I learned to stop chasing it. In another life, in another room, what I did mattered very much. I owned a restaurant called Laurel, not a small one, not a struggling one, a destination that people traveled across the country to experience. Tables were booked 3 months in advance. Food critics wrote about the attention to detail, the warmth of the service, the way every evening felt curated without feeling forced. We had been featured in national magazines recommended by chefs who could have dismissed us as competition, but chose instead to send their friends. I had started it 8 years earlier with savings I had scraped together from jobs my family never asked about, loans I paid back ahead of schedule, and a vision nobody believed in except me. The name came from a memory I had almost forgotten. When I was 7, my grandmother took me to her garden and showed me a laurel bush growing against the back fence. "This plant means victory," she told me, breaking off a small branch and tucking it behind my ear. "The Greeks used to crown their heroes with it." She died 2 years later, and no one in my family ever mentioned her garden again. But I remembered. When I signed the lease on my first location, I knew what I would call it before I knew what color to paint the walls. The early years were brutal. I remember nights when I stayed at the restaurant until 3 in the morning, reviewing orders, fixing mistakes, learning everything the hard way, because I couldn't afford to hire people who already knew. I remember the first time a customer sent back a dish, and I wanted to cry in the walk-in cooler. I remember standing there among the produce crates, pressing my palms against my eyes, telling myself that if I could just get through the next hour, the next service, the next week, something would change. I remember the first time a review called us one of the best-kept secrets in the city, and I printed it out and taped it to the wall behind the bar where only the staff could see it. My sous chef, a woman named Grace, who had been with me since month 3, read it aloud during our pre-service meeting. The team applauded, and I had to turn away so they wouldn't see my eyes watering. It was the first time anyone had validated what I was trying to build. The first time the work felt like it might actually lead somewhere. Grace was still with me 8 years later. She had turned down offers from bigger restaurants, more prestigious kitchens. When I asked her why she stayed, she shrugged and said, "Because you actually listen. You don't pretend to know everything. That's rare." I didn't know how to respond, so I gave her a raise and hoped that said enough. There was a moment about 4 years in when everything almost fell apart. A supplier disappeared with a payment I had made in advance. A key employee quit without notice during our busiest season. The building's plumbing failed in a way that shut us down for 11 days. I remember sitting alone at the bar after midnight, adding up numbers that didn't work, wondering if I had made a mistake that would cost me everything. I called my parents that night. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted them to tell me it would be okay. Maybe I just wanted to hear a familiar voice. My mother answered on the 4th ring, sounding distracted. I told her I was having a hard time at work. She said, "Oh, honey, everyone has bad days. You'll figure it out. Listen, I have to go. Your father needs me for something." The call lasted less than 2 minutes. I sat there for a long time after she hung up, staring at my phone, feeling something close inside me that I hadn't even realized was still open. But I didn't quit. I found another supplier. I hired someone better. I negotiated with this building owner and got a rent reduction in exchange for handling the repairs myself. I spent 3 nights sleeping on the office couch so I could supervise the plumbers and electricians. When we reopened, we were stronger than before. The regulars came back. The reviews stayed positive. We survived. That was when I understood something about myself that my family had never bothered to learn. I didn't fold under pressure. I got quieter, more focused, more determined. The same qualities they dismissed as lack of ambition were the ones that kept my business alive. A typical day at Laurel started at 10 in the morning and didn't end until well past midnight. I would arrive before anyone else, walking through the empty dining room, checking the tables, adjusting a chair here, a napkin there. Small things that no one would notice unless they were wrong. Then the deliveries would start, and Grace would arrive, and the kitchen would fill with the sounds of prep work and conversation and occasional laughter. I loved those hours before service, the anticipation, the possibility. Every night was a chance to get it right, to give someone an evening they would remember. I had regulars who came monthly, who knew the staff by name, who sent thank you notes after special occasions we had helped them celebrate. A man proposed to his girlfriend at table 7, and she said yes, and they came back every anniversary afterward. A woman hosted her mother's 80th birthday in our private room, and when her mother passed 6 months later, she wrote me a letter saying that dinner had been one of the last truly happy nights they shared together. Those moments kept me going when the numbers got tight, or the reviews got harsh, or the exhaustion made me wonder if any of it was worth it. My days were structured by decisions that didn't leave room for ambiguity. I coordinated teams who didn't have time for guesswork. I approved budgets that required accountability. I sat in meetings where opinions carried weight because consequences followed them. No one at work asked where my clothes came from. No one wondered if I belonged. When I spoke, people listened not because I demanded it, but because it made sense to. The contrast used to confuse me. I would leave work feeling aligned and capable, then step into a family dinner and feel myself flatten. It wasn't that I became someone else. It was that the version of me they recognized had been decided long ago, and anything outside it was quietly ignored. My phone would buzz during meetings with messages from home about events I hadn't been asked to help plan, awards dinner reminders, timing updates, outfit discussions. Not once did anyone ask how my day had gone or what I was working on. They didn't mean to exclude me from their thoughts. They simply didn't factor me in. The label they used most often was unambitious. It slipped out casually dressed as concern. "You're not like your brother," my father said once, as if that were a diagnosis. "At least you're stable," my mother added, as if stability were a consolation prize for not wanting more. My sister liked to explain things to people before I could speak for myself. She doesn't like the spotlight. It wasn't untrue, but it wasn't the truth either. I didn't avoid the spotlight. I avoided performing for people who mistook noise for value. Words shape rooms. Over time, their language built a small, padded version of me that fit neatly into the family story. The one who didn't push, the one who didn't need much, the one who would be fine wherever she landed. It was convenient for everyone else. It meant no one had to adjust their expectations or make space. Success in our house was something you displayed. If you didn't display it, it didn't count. I remember one dinner years ago when I still believed enthusiasm might matter. I had been working on a major event, one of the first times a private investment fund had booked our entire venue for an evening. I was proud of it, not in a loud way, but in the quiet way you feel when something hard finally comes together. Halfway through the meal, during a lull that seemed safe, I mentioned it. My brother cut in before I finished steering the conversation toward a client of his own. My mother nodded along, then asked someone to pass the bread. Someone said we'd talk about it later. Later never came. The table filled with other voices and my words dissolved into background noise. I remember going home that night and sitting on my couch in the dark for a long time. Not crying, just sitting, feeling the weight of being invisible to the people who were supposed to know me best. The next morning, I got up and went to work and did my job and didn't mention the dinner to anyone. What would have been the point? That was when something shifted. Not with anger, with clarity. I understood that explaining myself wouldn't change my position. It would only exhaust me. So I stopped offering context that wasn't requested. I stopped correcting assumptions that weren't curious enough to care. I kept my work where it belonged, in rooms that understood it. At home, it became easier in its own way. I let them believe what they wanted. Silence became self-preservation. 3 weeks before the awards dinner, a calendar invite landed in my inbox. The subject line matched the event my family had been discussing for months. My father's company had chosen Laurel as the venue. They didn't know it was mine. The booking had gone through the usual corporate channels handled by a coordinator who had no idea about my family connection. When I saw the confirmation, I read it twice. Not because I was surprised, because the parallel paths I had been walking for years were about to intersect in a way that couldn't be ignored. I sat at my desk for a long time after I saw that email. My hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, from something I couldn't quite name, anticipation maybe, or the strange vertigo of watching two separate lives collide. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't change my plans. I confirmed the booking through my general manager and let the preparation continue as it always did. Professionally, precisely, without drama. Grace noticed something was off during our planning meeting. "You okay?" she asked, studying my face in that direct way she had. "You seem distracted." "Family stuff," I said, which was true enough. She nodded and didn't push. That was another thing I appreciated about her. She knew when to ask and when to leave things alone. That same week, my mother called to remind me about the dinner again. "Make sure you're on a time," she said. "It's important." I told her I would be there. She paused, then added almost as an afterthought, "You're doing okay, right?" It was the closest she had come to asking about my life in months. I said yes. She sounded relieved, not because she knew the truth, but because she didn't have to ask more questions. After the call, I looked at the calendar invite again. The date, the time, the location that carried my name on every legal document. Laurel, victory. My grandmother's gift grown into something real. They had never asked what I did. They had never needed to. Their version of me didn't require it. But very soon, they were going to find out. My mother didn't mention the awards dinner when she texted me that afternoon. That was the first thing that made my stomach tighten. Her messages were usually efficient, anchored to logistics or reminders. This one arrived unprompted and carried a tone I recognized too well. "You've changed lately," she wrote. Not angry, not accusatory, just observational, like she was pointing out the weather. I stared at the screen longer than I needed to, waiting for a follow-up that would make it about a schedule or an outfit or something I could fix. It didn't come. A few seconds later, another message appeared. "I'm just worried people might misunderstand you." There it was. Concern dressed as protection. In our family, misunderstanding was always framed as something you invited by existing incorrectly. It was never about someone else's assumptions. It was about your failure to manage them. Over the years, I learned that worry didn't mean care. It meant discomfort. It meant someone felt uneasy about how you were showing up, and instead of examining that unease, they handed it back to you to resolve. I typed a neutral response, then deleted it. I closed my phone and went back to work, but the words lingered. Later that evening, the pattern continued. My father called brief and oddly gentle. He didn't mention the video or the dinner. He asked how I was doing the way people ask when they don't want an honest answer. Before I could say much, he added, "You know you've always been a little different. It's not a bad thing." He paused, letting the implication settle. You just have to be mindful. Mindful of what he didn't say. I murmured something agreeable, the sound of a daughter who understood the rules. We hung up without resolving anything, which was exactly the point. They never told me outright to change. They didn't need to. The language was subtle, refined, through years of repetition. Be careful. Don't overthink. Not everyone is used to your way. Each phrase shaved off a small edge, encouraging me to smooth myself into something more palatable. They framed it as kindness, as if the world were a fragile thing that needed protection from my presence. It took me a long time to realize the discomfort wasn't out there. It lived at home. A memory surfaced that night, uninvited and sharp. I was in my 20s, still naive enough to believe enthusiasm was a virtue everywhere. I had shared an idea at a family gathering, something I was genuinely excited about. My voice was animated. My hands moved as I spoke. I remember the way the room shifted, the glances exchanged, the gentle laughter. "You're doing a bit much," my aunt had said, smiling. My mother squeezed my arm and whispered, "Not everyone needs that level of intensity." The message was clear. Tone it down. Be less. The idea itself hadn't been wrong. I had been. That lesson repeated itself in quieter ways over the years. Opinions softened before they left my mouth. Reactions muted. Pride trimmed into something almost apologetic. No one asked me to disappear. They just preferred me smaller, easier to place, easier to explain. Another memory followed the first. I was 32, standing in my mother's kitchen, telling her about a business award I had been nominated for in the restaurant industry. She listened while loading the dishwasher, not looking at me. When I finished, she said, "That's nice. Have you thought about what you'll wear to David's promotion party?" My brother's promotion party. An event 3 months away. My award, which was happening in 2 weeks, had already been filed under things that didn't require attention. I remember standing there watching her arrange plates, understanding that I could win every award in my industry, and it would never register on the scale they used to measure success. Their scale only counted what they could brag about at dinner parties. A daughter who ran a restaurant didn't fit the story they wanted to tell. My sister called the next day, her voice bright and conspiratorial. She didn't mention our parents or the video. Instead, she spoke as if we were on the same side of an unspoken problem. "You know," she said, "I think if you just stayed a little more low-key, things would be smoother. People don't hate you. They just don't know how to read you." I listened, the old reflex to accommodate stirring in my chest. When she finished, I asked quietly, "Do you want them to understand me, or do you want me to disappear enough that they don't have to try?" The line went silent. She laughed awkwardly, then changed the subject. We hung up without circling back. That was when it clicked. This wasn't about an outfit or a tone or a single incident. It was about permission. Who was allowed to take up space and on what terms? My family was comfortable with me as long as I fit the version they had already accepted. The moment I stepped outside, it even accidentally they reached for familiar tools to nudge me back into place. Concern, worry, advice. Never commands, never accountability. I thought about how often I had adjusted myself without realizing it. How many decisions I had framed around what would keep the peace rather than what felt true. It wasn't a strategy, it was survival. But survival has a cost, and I could feel it now, heavy and undeniable. The question wasn't how to avoid being misunderstood anymore. It was whether I was willing to keep editing myself for the comfort of people who never asked what those edits cost me. I didn't announce a decision. There was no confrontation, no speech about boundaries. I simply stopped participating in the negotiations. When my mother sent another message suggesting I be careful how I came across, I replied with a brief acknowledgement and nothing more. When my sister tried to coach me on the presentation, I thanked her and changed the subject. I didn't justify, I didn't explain, I didn't adjust. The shift was small enough that no one noticed right away. For years, I had believed any deviation would cause friction. But the world didn't crack open when I held my ground. Conversations moved on. Silence filled the spaces where my compliance used to live. It felt unfamiliar, but not uncomfortable. It felt honest. The night before the dinner, I stood in my apartment and considered the quiet. There was no anxiety buzzing under my skin, no rehearsed responses waiting to be deployed. I wasn't preparing to perform or to disappear. I was simply going to show up as myself without preemptive apologies. It felt less like defiance and more like relief. They thought the problem was how I appeared. I was beginning to understand that the real problem was their refusal to see me fully. And for the first time, I wasn't interested in making that easier for them. The morning of the awards dinner arrived like any other weekday, quiet, ordinary, procedural. That alone should have warned me how disconnected our priorities had become. My phone buzzed before I finished my coffee, a string of messages stacked on top of each other without pause. Arrival times, ride coordination, a reminder about photos. Someone asked whether I had confirmed my seat yet, as if seating were the only thing that mattered. No one asked if I had slept well, no one asked how I was feeling. The assumption was that I would orbit their plans the way I always had, silently adjusting myself to match their gravity. I skimmed the messages replied with brief acknowledgments and closed the thread. Then I grabbed my bag and went to work. The office didn't know it was a special day, and I appreciated that more than I expected. I had set up a workspace at the restaurant years ago, a small room behind the main office, where I could handle administrative tasks without interrupting service. My calendar was full. Calls started on time. Decisions landed where they needed to. I moved through the morning without thinking about the evening ahead, not because I was avoiding it, but because it didn't require rehearsal. While my family fretted over appearances, I focused on operations. While they planned how they would be seen, I handled things that would exist whether anyone looked or not. The contrast felt sharp. Two versions of importance unfolding on the same day, unaware of each other. By midday, the assumptions in my phone began to pile up. My sister texted to tell me not to arrive early because it might feel awkward. She meant it kindly, I think, but the implication was clear. There would be a right time for me to appear, and it wouldn't be when important things were happening. My brother followed up with advice to stay close to him once I got there, so he could introduce me to people if needed. My father chimed in with a reminder that all I had to do was show up. The simplicity of that instruction carried weight. Show up, be present, don't complicate things. None of them asked how I planned to get there, whether I needed anything, or what my evening looked like beyond their frame. Dependents had been assigned to me without consultation. I left work at the usual hour. Not early, not rushed. The city moved around me with the indifference of a place that didn't care about family drama or social performances. By the time I reached the venue, my family had already arrived together. Their entrance had been synchronized, their energy unified. They stepped inside as a group greeted by staff who recognized names on a list and guided them forward with practiced efficiency. I watched from a distance as they were ushered along confident and unhurried, already settled into the belief that this night belonged to them. I didn't follow the same path. I arrived alone not because I had been excluded, but because I had chosen not to join their procession. There was no line to stand in, no need to announce myself. A staff member caught my eye, hesitated for half a second, then nodded with recognition. The interaction was brief, almost invisible, and entirely different from the one my family had just experienced. I was guided through a side corridor, a path reserved for people who belonged to the operation rather than the audience. The room didn't change when I entered, but the way it held itself did. That shift went unnoticed by the people who had stopped looking for me. My family settled into their seats with the ease of people accustomed to being centered. They laughed, loudly shared stories, and pointed out details they found impressive. Compliments came their way, and they accepted them as confirmation rather than coincidence. My sister angled her phone for a quick video, capturing the glow of the room and her own satisfaction. My brother remarked that our father must have pulled some strings to secure a place like this. My father smiled, pleased with the implication. From where I stood a few steps removed, I could see how complete their confidence was. They believed the setting reflected their status. They didn't realize how easily settings can be mistaken for mirrors. I didn't approach them. I stayed where I was watching without urgency. A senior staff member passed by, paused, and leaned in to ask a quiet question. I answered just as quietly. There was a nod of understanding, a brief exchange of confirmation, and then they moved on. The entire interaction took seconds. My family didn't notice. They were too busy performing, comfort too busy, enjoying the assumption that everything unfolding around them was a result of their own importance. The program edged closer to its start. The room filled with a low hum of anticipation. Glasses were raised. My sister declared the night well-deserved, her voice carrying just far enough to be heard by the tables nearby. My family toasted themselves. To work hard, to good timing, to the satisfaction of being in the right place. I felt no urge to interrupt them. The moment didn't require my presence yet. It required their certainty. I watched as people began to take note of the room in a different way. Small adjustments rippling outward. Conversations paused and restarted. Attention shifted subtly like a current changing direction. None of it pointed toward my family. None of it included them. They didn't notice because they weren't looking. They had already decided where significance lived, and it wasn't in the periphery. I stayed still, allowing the distance to do its work. There is a tension that builds when truth sits just out of frame, close enough to be felt, but not yet acknowledged. I could sense it now, tightening the air. My family laughed again, oblivious. They believed they were seated in the most important place in the room. They didn't know that importance had little to do with where you sat, and everything to do with when you were seen. As the lights shifted and the first notes of attention gathered at the front, I took a breath. Not to steady myself, to mark the moment. They were exactly where they thought they should be. That was the mistake. They were in the right place for the wrong reasons, convinced that the view from their table told the whole story. It didn't occur to them to look for me because in their minds, I had never left the margins. They raised their glasses one more time, my sister calling the night perfect. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I simply acknowledged the precision of the timing. They believed they were sitting in the most prestigious position available. They didn't know they were sitting exactly where they needed to be, waiting for the moment when the room would finally notice who had been there all along. I stepped forward without announcing myself, and the room adjusted as if it had been expecting me all along. There was no sudden hush, no dramatic turn of heads, just a subtle rearranging of bodies and attention that created a clear path where there hadn't been one a moment earlier. Staff shifted instinctively, not because I asked them to, but because they recognized something familiar in the way I moved, the way I belonged to the flow rather than fighting it. I didn't rush. I didn't search for my family's faces. I let the distance close at its own pace, each step measured unhurried, carrying a weight that didn't need words to justify it. From their table, the change registered as a disturbance before it registered as me. My sister's laughter cut off mid-sentence, the sound flattening into an awkward pause. She lowered her phone, the stream she had been half-heartedly running forgotten as her eyes narrowed. She leaned toward my brother and whispered something sharp and incredulous, her gaze flicking between me and the staff who had parted without hesitation. My brother followed her line of sight, his expression tightening as he scanned the room for someone to intervene, someone to explain why this was happening. No one did. My father noticed last his practiced smile holding for a beat too long before faltering. He adjusted in his seat, glancing around as if the room had shifted its angles without consulting him. The closer I got, the more the room seemed to recalibrate. Conversations that had been directed toward my family drifted elsewhere. A few guests I recognized nodded in passing brief acknowledgments exchanged without ceremony. They didn't stop me or call out. They didn't make a show of familiarity. It was the kind of recognition that didn't need to be proven. My family watched these interactions with growing unease. Their confidence thinned as they realized they were no longer the center of the exchange they had assumed was theirs. My sister tried to recover first. She straightened, plastering on a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and attempted to catch the attention of a nearby guest who had been speaking animatedly moments earlier. The guest offered a polite nod and turned away their focus, already redirected. My sister's smile flickered. She glanced at her phone, then set it down. The impulse to document had suddenly lost its purpose. My brother cleared his throat and made a joke, his voice louder than necessary, the punchline landing in a pocket of indifference. No one laughed. My father lifted his glass in a half-formed toast, a gesture that usually drew immediate response. This time the expected reaction didn't come. He lowered the glass slowly, confusion settling into the lines of his face. I could feel the shift before I reached them. Authority in a room changes hands without formal announcements. It wasn't taken from them. It simply stopped responding. They were experiencing for the first time what it felt like to speak and not be heard, to signal importance and receive nothing back. The air around their table grew heavier, charged with the realization that the rules they relied on were no longer in effect. I stopped just behind them, close enough to feel the tension ripple outward. They hadn't turned yet, not fully, as if acknowledging me would make the unease real. A senior staff member approached from the side posture, respectful voice low. They asked a question meant only for me, a procedural check that confirmed what had already been decided. I nodded once. The exchange was brief, efficient, invisible to anyone not looking for it. My family heard the murmur, but couldn't make out the words. That uncertainty unsettled them more than any announcement could have. My sister was the first to turn. Her eyes met mine, and for a fraction of a second the old pattern tried to reassert itself. There was surprise, yes, but also something like disbelief, as if she were waiting for me to apologize for being there to explain myself back into the margins. I didn't. I held her gaze without challenge, without apology, and watched as her confidence slipped. My brother followed his expression, a mix of irritation and calculation, trying to assess what he was missing, how this situation had unfolded without his awareness. My father turned last, slower than the others, his smile gone entirely now. He looked at me as if seeing a version of me that didn't align with the one he had rehearsed for years. No one spoke. The silence stretched, not empty, but full of questions no one dared to ask out loud. Around us, the room continued to move, attention flowing past their table as if it were no longer a focal point. They had believed the evening revolved around their presence, that their seating guaranteed significance. Standing there, I could see the moment that belief cracked. It wasn't dramatic. It was worse. It was quiet. My brother shifted in his chair, the humor he usually wielded as a shield nowhere to be found. He glanced at my father, then back at me, his jaw tightening. My sister's hands hovered near her phone, uncertain whether to pick it up or leave it where it was. My father sat still, shoulders squared by habit, eyes searching mine for an explanation I had no intention of providing. They were waiting for me to say something, to break the tension, to restore the familiar hierarchy with a few self-deprecating words. I didn't give them that relief. The staff member spoke again, softer this time, a simple prompt that signaled readiness. I acknowledged it with another nod, my focus never leaving my family's faces. The exchange was enough to confirm what they were beginning to understand. Whatever authority governed this space did not answer to them. Around us, a few heads turned, curiosity sharpening into interest. Whispers threaded through the room, not loud enough to carry, but persistent enough to be felt. My family sensed it. They had spent their lives reading rooms, leveraging perception, and now that skill betrayed them. The more they tried to regain their footing, the more obvious their loss of balance became. I stood there close enough to hear my sister's breath hitch, close enough to see the calculation in my brother's eyes falter, close enough to feel my father's authority drain into something fragile. I didn't need to say who I was or why I was there. The room was already responding in ways that made explanations unnecessary. This wasn't a confrontation. It was a correction. They had believed I didn't belong at this table, that my place was somewhere else, quieter, less visible. Standing there, I could see them grappling with a new question, one that unsettled them far more than my presence ever had. It wasn't about whether I deserved to be there. It was about whether they did. For a long moment, no one moved. The silence pressed in heavy and expectant, and in that space the truth settled without being spoken. They had built their certainty on assumptions that no longer held, and now they were left to sit with the discomfort of being seen through a lens they couldn't control. I didn't step back. I didn't step forward. I let the moment breathe, knowing that whatever came next would land harder because it arrived without warning. They had once believed I wasn't worthy of sitting with them. Now, as the room adjusted around us, they were forced to confront a far more unsettling possibility. Maybe the question had never been whether I belonged at the table. Maybe it was whether they were prepared to remain there once the room finally saw us clearly. I stopped at the edge of the table close enough that they could no longer pretend I was a coincidence, far enough that no one could accuse me of invading their space. My heart was pounding harder than I wanted to admit. I could feel my pulse in my throat, that familiar rush of adrenaline that comes right before you do something you cannot take back. For a moment, I thought about turning around, walking away, letting them have their evening and their assumptions and their comfortable version of me. But I had spent 38 years turning around. I didn't clear my throat. I didn't say anyone's name. I let the silence stretch just long enough to feel deliberate, then spoke in a voice that I hoped sounded calmer than I felt. "Welcome to my restaurant." I paused. My hands were trembling slightly at my sides, so I clasped them together in front of me. I hoped no one noticed. "We only serve real VIPs." I didn't smile. I didn't explain. I let the words land where they landed and stayed still, even though every instinct told me to fill the silence with something softer, something that would make this easier for everyone. For half a second, no one reacted. It was the kind of pause that feels unreal, like the moment after a glass slips from your hand but before it hits the floor. Then my sister laughed, a short, brittle sound that didn't invite company. "What are you talking about?" she said too quickly, like speed could turn confusion into confidence. She glanced around expecting someone to correct me, to reassure her this was some kind of joke she was missing. My brother's eyes darted toward the staff, scanning for a familiar face who would intervene and restore order. My mother's smile stayed in place, but her hand tightened around her glass until her knuckles whitened. My father said nothing. He just watched me, his expression unreadable in a way I had never seen before. They were used to controlling narratives by reacting first by laughing things off or redirecting attention. This time their instincts failed them. My sister's laughter hung in the air unanswered. My brother's search came up empty. My mother's smile began to tremble with effort. My father remained silent, and that silence was louder than any denial he could have offered. A senior manager named Rachel approached from my side, stepping into the space as naturally as if she had always been part of the scene. She didn't look at my family when she spoke. Her focus stayed on me, her tone respectful and professional. She addressed me by name the way people do when they're accustomed to doing so, and confirmed the next detail of the evening with a brief question. I answered just as briefly, grateful that my voice held steady. The exchange took seconds, but it shifted the room in a way nothing else could have. No mention of money, no declaration of ownership, just a simple acknowledgement of authority delivered without ceremony. My sister's face drained of color as the implication settled. She looked from Rachel to me, her mouth opening and closing, as if testing words she didn't dare use. My brother leaned back slightly, the calculation in his eyes turning frantic as he tried to piece together what he had missed. My mother's grip on her glass loosened, then tightened again, her smile finally slipping as she realized no one was coming to rescue them from this moment. My father exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping a fraction. The first visible sign that he understood something fundamental had changed. Around us, attention sharpened. Conversations nearby slowed, then stopped. A few guests glanced over openly, now curiosity no longer disguised. Others pretended not to stare, but their interest showed in how their bodies angled toward us. The room had found its focal point, and it wasn't the one my family had expected. I didn't elaborate. I didn't turn to explain myself. Instead, I asked Rachel a practical question about timing, about whether everything was ready to proceed as planned. She answered immediately confidently, as if my presence and my role were the most natural things in the world. The simplicity of the exchange made it impossible to dismiss. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a performance. It was infrastructure. My sister's eyes flicked to her phone, then away. The reflex to document to control perception through a screen surfaced and died in the same second. She knew instinctively that this was not a moment she could spin. My brother cleared his throat, opening his mouth as if to say something, then closing it when he realized he didn't know which version of me he was supposed to be talking to anymore. My mother stared at the table, her reflection warped on the surface of her glass. My father finally spoke. My name left his mouth carefully, as if it were unfamiliar. There was no accusation in his voice, no anger, just uncertainty. Something caught in my chest when I heard him say it. For a fraction of a second, I was 8 years old again, waiting for him to notice something. I had made something I was proud of, waiting for him to see me. I didn't respond. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because I didn't trust my voice. Any explanation would have softened the impact, given them something to argue with or reinterpret. And honestly, I was afraid that if I started talking, I might say too much. I might say everything I had been holding back for years, and this wasn't the place for that. A few guests stood drawn by the shift in energy. One offered me a greeting, another a brief word of appreciation. Their gestures were polite and restrained. Each interaction widened the distance between my family and the room they believed they commanded. No one asked them how they were doing. No one checked on their comfort. The social cues they relied on had evaporated, leaving them exposed in a way they had never experienced. My sister remembered the video then. I could see it in her eyes, the way her expression tightened as the past collided with the present. My brother remembered his comment, the casual cruelty of it, resurfacing with a clarity that made him wince. My mother remembered pressing, remembered laughing, and the weight of that memory settled heavily on her shoulders. My father remembered every time he had spoken for me, defined me, reduced me, and for the first time those memories didn't feel like authority. They felt like evidence. I stayed where I was, letting the room continue its quiet reorganization. This wasn't about humiliating them. It really wasn't. Part of me wished I could explain that to them somehow. I didn't want them to suffer. I just wanted them to see. There's a difference, even if it doesn't feel like one at the moment. Eventually, Rachel returned to my side, a subtle signal that it was time to move on. I acknowledged her with a nod, then turned slightly, my body angling away from my family without dismissing them outright. It was a small movement, but it said everything. I wasn't here to confront them. I was here to do my work. As I stepped away, I felt my eyes sting unexpectedly. I blinked it back quickly, grateful that I was facing away from them now. This was harder than I thought it would be. Easier in some ways, harder in others. The fantasy of this moment had never included the ache that came with it. The silence followed me for a moment before breaking apart into whispers and resumed conversations. My family remained at the table, surrounded by people, yet utterly alone. The center of attention they had coveted replaced by something colder and far less comfortable. They didn't call after me. They didn't stop me. They couldn't. The room had already made its choice. I didn't look back. I wanted to, but I didn't. Looking back would have been asking for something, for acknowledgement or apology or understanding, and I had spent too many years asking. I hadn't come to prove who I was. I had come to let them see what they had never bothered to learn. And now that they had, the consequences were no longer mine to manage. The table didn't move, but the room did. My family remained seated exactly where they had been, hands folded, glasses half full, posture stiff with the memory of confidence. Yet the space around them thinned, as if the air itself had decided to circulate elsewhere. Conversations that once bent in their direction now angled away. Laughter rose from other tables and slid past them without catching. They were still visible, still present, but no longer anchored to anything that mattered. The realization arrived slowly enough to be cruel. I watched from across the room, busying myself with the details of hosting that had become second nature over the years. Checking in with the kitchen, confirming the timing of the next course, making sure the servers had everything they needed, normal things, the things I did every night regardless of who was sitting at which table. But tonight wasn't normal, and pretending otherwise took more effort than I expected. My sister tried first to reclaim what she had lost. She straightened her shoulders, smiled with practiced ease, and lifted her phone again, searching for a frame that would make sense of the moment. She tapped the screen, checked the signal, adjusted the angle, then went live with a brittle brightness that didn't reach her eyes. The comments didn't come. The viewer count stalled, then dipped. She laughed too loudly at something no one had said, and ended the stream with a sharp swipe, her hand shaking just enough to notice. She set the phone down and didn't pick it up again. I felt something twist in my stomach watching her. Not satisfied. Something more complicated than that. My sister had built her entire identity around being watched, and now the watching had turned into something else entirely. I knew what that felt like, the ground shifting beneath you when you thought you knew exactly where you stood. My brother leaned back and scanned the room, identifying faces he knew, faces that had once responded to a nod or a raised glass. He stood, smoothed his jacket, and approached one of them with a grin he had used 100 times before. The man returned the greeting politely, glanced past him, and excused himself with an apology that sounded sincere but final. My brother hovered for a second, then retreated, the grin collapsing into something smaller and more guarded. He tried again with another familiar figure, and was met with a distracted smile and a quick pivot away. Each attempt stripped a layer of certainty from him, leaving behind an unease he couldn't joke his way out of. My mother signaled for a staff member, her movement subtle, confident in the way people get when they expect service without question. The staff member approached, listened carefully, and responded with impeccable professionalism, but without warmth. No deference, no special accommodation. Just the rules applied evenly. My mother nodded, thanked them, and watched as they moved on without lingering. Her lips pressed together, the polite mask finally slipping, as she realized courtesy wasn't the same as priority. Around them, whispers began to travel. Not loud enough to challenge, not bold enough to confront, but persistent. Questions floated from table to table, curiosity sharpening into speculation. Who was she? Why had the manager deferred to her? What was her role here? No one answered outright. No one needed to. The absence of denial spoke louder than any explanation could have. Rachel found me near the kitchen entrance, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes asking a question. "Everything okay?" she asked quietly. I nodded, then shook my head, then shrugged. "I don't know," I admitted. I thought I would feel different. Different how? I considered the question. I don't know. More victorious, maybe, or more relieved. Instead, I just feel, and I searched for the right word and couldn't find it, tired. Rachel nodded like she understood, even though she couldn't possibly understand all of it. "You want me to handle anything, keep them comfortable?" "No," I said and meant it. "Just treat them like any other guests. That's all I want." She nodded again and moved away to handle something else, leaving me alone with my thoughts for a moment. My father leaned toward my brother, his voice low, controlled. I couldn't hear what he said, but I could imagine it. Something neat and dismissible. A misunderstanding. A publicity arrangement. A coincidence blown out of proportion. My brother latched onto it immediately, nodding with relief, adding his own rationalizations. My mother listened in silence, her gaze fixed on the table, fingers tracing the stem of her glass. She didn't agree. She didn't argue. Her quiet carried more weight than either of them realized. My sister picked up her phone again, not to stream, but to scroll her thumb, moving faster as she searched for something familiar to ground her. I knew what she would find. The video was still there, the one that had started everything. And by now the comments would have shifted. Where there had once been laughter, there would be confusion. Questions, recognition dawning in real time. She read one comment aloud, without meaning to, her voice catching on the words. "Wait, isn't this her place?" Another followed, then another, each one tightening the knot in her chest. I could see it from across the room, the way her shoulders hunched slightly, the way she locked the phone and stared straight ahead, as if refusing to see could undo what had already been seen. My brother glanced at her screen despite himself, his jaw clenching as he recognized the turn. He scrolled through his own notifications, the casual cruelty of his comment resurfacing in screenshots and replies he couldn't delete fast enough. My mother closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of it settling fully. She understood something the others didn't yet. This wasn't about tonight alone. This was about permanence, about how the internet doesn't forget how laughter leaves a residue that no amount of damage control can scrub away. She opened her eyes and looked toward where I stood. Our gazes met for just a second before I looked away. I wasn't ready to face whatever was in her eyes. Not yet. Maybe not ever. My father's voice grew firmer, his denial sharpening into irritation. He raised his glass again, attempting to summon the old ritual, but the gesture felt hollow now. A habit stripped of context, the room continued without them. I turned back to my work, checking on a server who seemed overwhelmed adjusting a place setting that didn't need adjusting, doing all the small things that kept my hands busy and my mind from wandering too far into territory I wasn't ready to explore. This wasn't revenge fueled by confrontation. It was a consequence fueled by exposure. And consequences, I was learning, felt different than I had imagined. Heavier, more complicated, less clean. By the time the program neared its end, my family looked smaller somehow. Their confidence is worn thin by hours of quiet recalibration. They had arrived believing they could shape the narrative. They were leaving with the understanding that narratives once released take on lives of their own. And I was left standing in the middle of it all wondering if this was what closure felt like or just another kind of beginning. The first time my name carried weight in that room, it didn't come from me. It came from Victoria, the event coordinator who had worked with me for 6 years. She had been there when I signed the lease on this building, when I stayed up for 3 days straight before our first major event, when I cried in the storage room after a reviewer called our food transcendent. And I finally let myself believe this might actually work. Her voice was clear and unhurried, rising just enough to cut through the ambient murmur as the program shifted toward its closing acknowledgments. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't lean into suspense. She simply paused, smiled at the audience, and thanked the people who had made the evening possible. When she said my name, she said it the way professionals say the names of people who matter, with ease, with certainty, as if there had never been any question at all. She didn't explain. She didn't elaborate. She didn't gesture in my direction for applause. She moved on, and that was the most powerful part. The room reacted anyway, not with gasps or cheers, but with a subtle recalibration. The kind you feel more than hear. A collective adjustment as attention quietly pivoted and settled somewhere new. I felt it ripple outward, and for a moment I didn't know what to do with my hands. I had spent so many years being invisible in rooms like this that visibility felt foreign, like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. I wanted to shrink back into the familiar comfort of being overlooked. Instead, I made myself stand still. I made myself breathe. I made myself take up the space I had earned. A few people glanced toward me, curiosity tempered by recognition, and then they did something even more telling. They acted as if this information had always been obvious. A man I had spoken with earlier raised his glass in my direction without ceremony. A woman across the room nodded once decisively, as if confirming a thought she had already formed. No one asked me to clarify. No one needed to. At my family's table, the shift landed like a delayed echo. My mother's head snapped up at the sound of my name, her eyes searching Victoria's face for context that wasn't coming. My brother froze his hand halfway to his glass, then set it down, as if unsure what to do with it. My sister's shoulders stiffened, her gaze darting from the stage to the room, tracking reactions she couldn't control. My father leaned back, his expression unreadable. The practiced calm of a man used to being acknowledged publicly was now working against him, as he realized this acknowledgement wasn't his. People began to move. Not all at once, not in a rush, but with intention. A cluster of guests shifted in my direction, forming and reforming organically the way groups do when they sense gravity. They greeted me without hesitation, without preamble speaking, as if we had always been meant to talk, as if the barrier that had once existed had simply dissolved. A few mentioned the event, thanked me for my role in it, without probing for details, and moved on confident in the exchange. It wasn't flattery, it was alignment. And it felt strange and wonderful and terrifying all at once. Victoria continued through the program, unbothered by the undercurrent she had set in motion. That mattered. She wasn't performing advocacy. She was doing her job, and in doing it well, she made the recognition unassailable. My father tried to intervene. He rose from his chair and approached a conversation I was having with a pair of executives. His smile was polite, his timing off by just enough to matter. I saw him coming and felt my stomach clench. Part of me wanted to welcome him into the conversation, to smooth things over the way I had always done. Part of me wanted to turn my back completely. I did neither. I just kept talking, letting him hover at the edge of the group until one of the executives greeted him. Warmly, listened for a beat, and then excused himself with a glance at his watch. My father stood alone for a fraction of a second too long before he retreated. The confidence in his stride was replaced by something more careful. I didn't feel victorious. I felt something closer to grief. This was my father, the man who had taught me to ride a bike, who had stayed up late helping me with science projects in elementary school before things changed. Before my brother became the obvious heir, and my sister became the obvious star, and I became the obvious afterthought. I wondered if he remembered those nights. I wondered if he knew how much they had meant to me, how long I had held on to them as proof that he had loved me once before I stopped being useful to his image of success. My brother attempted a similar maneuver moments later, inserting himself into a discussion with a joke that would have landed in any other room on any other night. It fell flat. The conversation shifted away from him without comment, not unkindly, just decisively. I didn't feel victorious. I felt settled. The difference surprised me. There was no surge of adrenaline, no rush of vindication. Just a steady, quiet clarity, the kind that comes when a long-standing imbalance finally corrects itself. Across the room, my sister leaned toward my mother, her voice too low to hear, but her expression sharp with urgency. My mother responded with a single sentence, her mouth tight, her eyes flicking toward me and then away. Then my mother spoke again, quietly, barely audible, even from where I stood. "We were wrong," she said, not as a performance, not as a plea, as a statement of fact. Something cracked open inside me when I heard those words. 3 small words that I had waited my entire life to hear. They weren't enough to fix anything. They weren't an apology or an explanation or a promise to change, but they were true, and my mother had said them out loud, and that meant something. I wasn't sure what yet, but something. Victoria wrapped up her segment and thanked the audience again. She caught my eye as she stepped down from the small platform and gave me the smallest nod, a friend acknowledging another friend, a colleague recognizing a job well done. Such a simple thing, such a meaningful one. As the lights dimmed slightly and guests began to drift toward the exits, I took a moment for myself near the edge of the room. Not to hide, but to breathe in the space that had opened up. I realized then how much energy I had spent over the years translating myself, softening my edges, waiting for permission to be seen. I didn't need that permission anymore. It had been granted without my request by people who had no stake in my family's narrative, who saw only what was in front of them, and responded accordingly. I watched my family gather their things, their movements slower, more deliberate, as if they were recalibrating with every step. They didn't approach me. I didn't approach them. The distance felt appropriate for now. Maybe someday it would shrink. Maybe it wouldn't. I wasn't sure which outcome I was hoping for anymore. Sometimes the most liberating moment isn't the one where you speak up. It's the one where someone else says it out loud and the world listens. And you finally let yourself believe that you were worth listening to all along. The program moved forward without them. Not abruptly, not cruelly, just with a quiet certainty that didn't wait for permission. Names were called, achievements were acknowledged, applause rose landed where it was meant to, and faded again. My family sat through it all as if the current had shifted slightly and left their table untouched. I kept myself busy as the evening wound down, but I still caught myself glancing in their direction. I told myself it was part of being a good host, keeping an eye on the room. That wasn't the whole truth. Part of me was still that little girl at the family dinner table, tracking moods, anticipating shifts, bracing for what came next. Some habits take longer to break. My father adjusted in his seat, straightened his jacket, and glanced toward the stage as if a cue had been missed. It hadn't. The program was running exactly as planned. He just wasn't part of it anymore. Staff moved through the room with their usual efficiency, but when they reached my family's table, the difference became clear. Service arrived. Service left. No pause. No extra check-in. No subtle question about whether anything else might be needed. The small invisible preferences my family had grown used to were gone, replaced by something flatter and more even. Just the rules applied without exception. I had given my team clear instructions before the event. Treat them like any other guests. Professional courtesy. Nothing more, nothing less. No one questioned it. They didn't need to. The losses accumulated quietly. A conversation my father approached ended sooner than it should have. A handshake my brother offered was returned without follow-up. My sister once asked about projects and reach and numbers, fielded no questions at all. No one was unkind. No one was impressed either. Indifference settled in, and it carried more weight than rejection ever could. I found myself near the kitchen entrance again, watching without meaning to. Rachel appeared beside me with a clipboard and a question about next week's private event. I answered on autopilot, my attention still anchored across the room. "You okay?" she asked quietly when we finished. I considered lying, saying I was fine, saying this was exactly what I wanted. "I don't know," I said instead. "It's strange. Strange how I spent years imagining what it would feel like if they finally saw me," I said. "And now they do. I thought I'd feel proud, vindicated. Instead, I just feel sad." Rachel didn't try to fix it. She didn't offer reassurance. She stood with me for a moment, then squeezed my arm once and went back to work. Across the room, my mother glanced toward me and then looked away. My father sat still, hands folded, composure intact but strained. My sister traced a pattern on the table with her fingertip. My brother checked his watch, impatience replacing confidence. They looked lost. It was unsettling to witness. My whole life they had moved through the world with the certainty of people who had never been told they didn't belong. Now that certainty was gone, and they didn't know where to put their hands. I didn't intervene. I didn't offer comfort or clarification. Not because I wanted them to suffer, but because I didn't know what I could say without pulling us back into old roles. This wasn't a misunderstanding to correct. It was a recalibration. And recalibrations take time. As the program wound down, my family gathered their things carefully, movements measured as if trying not to attract attention that no longer responded. When they stood, no one rose with them. When they moved toward the exit, the flow of the room parted briefly and closed again without pause. I watched them go, my father's straight back, my mother's careful steps, my brother's hands shoved into his pockets. My sister clutched her phone like a lifeline that had stopped working. They had believed status could be held in place through visibility, through laughter, and the right seats in the room. Tonight they were learning that status exists only as long as other people agree to participate in it. Part of me wanted to run after them, to say something, to ask if there was a version of us that could exist without hierarchy, without favoritism, without the quiet cruelty of being overlooked. But I didn't. Tonight wasn't the moment. Too much had shifted. I stayed and finished what I had come to do, thanking the last guests, confirming cleanup, returning to the small, ordinary tasks that made up my life, a life I had built without permission or applause. Outside, the night air felt steadier, quieter without the hum of attention. I took a slow breath. Tomorrow I would wake up and do this all again. The same work, the same purpose, the same life I had chosen. The only difference was that now they knew, and knowing didn't change who I was. It only changed who they thought I was. That was enough. It had to be. I turned back towards the building, toward the work that was waiting, toward the life I had earned. Somewhere in the city, my family was driving home in silence, rearranging their understanding of the world to include a version of me they had never bothered to imagine. I hoped it was uncomfortable, and I hoped eventually it would lead to something better. But that work was theirs now. Mine was already done. My phone buzzed as the last of the staff began clearing tables in the main room. The message was short, almost formal. My father wanted to talk. Not tomorrow. Not later. Now. He didn't say where, but I knew it wouldn't be public. He wouldn't risk witnesses. I told him where I was and waited. My hands were steadier than I expected, but my heart was beating faster than I wanted to admit. The power dynamic had already shifted. We were just catching up to it. But knowing that didn't make this easy. Nothing about tonight had been easy. He arrived a few minutes later, slower than usual, his jacket folded over his arm instead of worn like armor. We stood near a quiet hallway far enough from the exits that no one passed by accidentally. The hum of the building was muted there, replaced by the low mechanical sounds of cleanup. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear Grace giving instructions to the kitchen crew. Normal sounds, grounding sounds. For the first time in my life, my father looked unsure of how to start. He cleared his throat, glanced at the floor, then back at me, as if searching for the version of me he was used to addressing. She wasn't there anymore. "I don't think tonight went the way anyone expected," he said finally. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation. It was a placeholder, a sentence meant to buy time. I didn't respond right away. Part of me wanted to fill the silence the way I always had, to make this easier for him to smooth over the discomfort with reassurance. That instinct was still there, buried deep, trained into me over decades of practice. I let it pass. I let the silence stretch long enough to become uncomfortable, long enough for him to realize he didn't have the lead in this conversation. He shifted his weight. I tried again. He mentioned misunderstandings. He mentioned how quickly things had escalated. He mentioned family. He avoided specifics with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating liability. When the apology came, it arrived carefully packaged. He said he was sorry things had gone too far. He said he regretted how the situation had been handled. He didn't mention the video. He didn't mention laughter or likes or comments that stayed visible long after the joke had landed. He didn't mention my name paired with the words "poor relative" for a million strangers to see. He apologized the way people do when they're trying to reduce damage, not when they're trying to acknowledge harm. I listened without interrupting. My expression is neutral. My hands clasped in front of me to hide the slight tremor I could feel starting. I recognized the tactic. I had grown up with it. My mother and brother joined us partway through, drawn by instinct or necessity. I wasn't sure which. They must have been waiting nearby, watching, trying to gauge how the conversation was going before deciding whether to intervene. My mother took a conciliatory tone immediately. She talked about healing, about how families go through phases, about how none of this needed to define us moving forward. She didn't say what this was. She didn't need to. "We've always been so close," she said, and something twisted in my chest at the lie of it. I don't want one difficult night to change that. My brother tried humor, a half smile paired with a shrug. "Come on," he said. "We all say stupid things sometimes. Remember when I called you a nerd in front of your prom date? You got over that." He was comparing a childhood teasing moment to a viral video that mocked me in front of millions. The gap between what he understood and what had actually happened felt unbridgeable. My sister arrived last standing, slightly apart from the others, arms crossed, her expression guarded but watchful. She didn't say anything. She just watched, and I wondered what was going through her mind, whether she understood yet what she had done, or whether she was still calculating how to spin this into content. No one said my name in connection with the video. No one named the behavior that had made tonight inevitable. They wanted to skip to resolution without sitting in accountability. I let them talk until they ran out of words. My mother's voice trailed off mid-sentence about family dinners and holidays. My brother's joke hung in the air unanswered. My father stood with his hands in his pockets, looking at a point somewhere past my shoulder. The silence that followed was heavy, full of everything they weren't saying. Then I spoke. When I did, my voice wavered slightly at first. I paused, took a breath, and started again. Quieter this time. Measured. Final. "The video wasn't a misunderstanding," I said. "It was a choice. You chose to film me without my permission. You chose to mock me publicly. You chose to comment and like and laugh. Those were choices." My sister opened her mouth to interrupt, and I held up my hand. "I'm not finished." She closed her mouth. "I've spent my entire life being the easy one," I continued. the one who didn't need attention, the one who didn't cause problems, the one who would show up and help and never ask for anything in return. And I did that because I thought eventually, if I was good enough, quiet enough, useful enough, you would see me. Really see me. My voice cracked slightly on the last words. I hadn't expected that. I pressed on anyway. You never did, and I've made my peace with that. But what I won't accept anymore is being actively diminished, being turned into a joke for strangers to laugh at, being treated like my dignity is less important than your entertainment. I looked at my father first. You liked the video. You didn't ask if I was okay. You called to ask if I was going to cause problems for the family. That told me everything I needed to know about where I stand with you. He flinched, slightly but visibly. I turned to my mother. You told me to be careful how I came across. You never once told them to be careful how they treated me. You've spent my whole life asking me to make myself smaller so everyone else could be more comfortable. I'm done doing that. Her eyes were wet now. She reached toward me, and I stepped back. Not cruelly, just clearly. I looked at my brother. The poor relative. That's what you called me, in front of 1 million people, because you thought it was funny, because you've always thought I was someone you could punch down at without consequences. I'm telling you now, there are consequences. He looked away, jaw tight. Finally, I turned to my sister. You built your platform on being relatable, on being honest, on being real. But there's nothing real about humiliating your own sister for engagement. There's nothing relatable about cruelty. I hope someday you understand the difference between content and harm. She didn't respond, but something in her expression shifted. I couldn't tell if it was shame or just the beginning of understanding. I took another breath. My hands were definitely shaking now, so I clasped them tighter. I'm not asking for another apology. I'm not asking for a public correction. I'm not asking for you to make this right because I'm not sure you can. What I'm doing is telling you what I expect moving forward. I looked at each of them in turn. I won't accept being treated as a punchline, publicly or privately. I won't participate in family gatherings where I'm expected to be invisible. I won't shrink myself so you can feel bigger. If you want a relationship with me, it will be based on mutual respect, not on my willingness to absorb disrespect quietly. I paused, letting the words settle. And if those expectations aren't met, I won't explain or argue or try to convince you. I'll simply leave, every time, without discussion. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't full of things unsaid. It was full of things that were finally spoken. My mother's tears were falling now, but she wasn't making a sound. My brother stood with his arms crossed, staring at the floor. My sister had uncrossed her arms, her posture shifting towards something that looked almost like acknowledgement. My father cleared his throat. He started, then stopped. I tried again. I didn't know about any of this, the restaurant, what you built. You didn't ask, I said, simply, without accusation. He nodded slowly, the gesture of someone acknowledging a truth he couldn't argue with. Your grandmother would have been proud, my mother said quietly, of Laurel. She always said you were the one who paid attention. Something caught in my throat. I hadn't expected her to remember the connection. I hadn't expected her to know. She was the only one who ever saw me, I said, until I learned to see myself. We stood there for a long moment, the 5 of us in that quiet hallway, with the muted sounds of cleanup around us. The family we had been with was gone. What we would become wasn't clear yet. Maybe nothing. Maybe something different. Maybe something better than before. I didn't know. And for the first time, I was okay with not knowing. This wasn't reconciliation. It was redefinition. I wasn't cutting them off. I wasn't inviting them back to the old version of us either. I was offering a third option, one that didn't center their comfort or my silence. My father finally spoke again, his voice lower than before. I understand, he said. He didn't argue. He didn't promise change. He simply acknowledged the reality of what I had said. My mother nodded, wiping her eyes. My brother mumbled something that might have been, I'm sorry, or might have been, I understand. I couldn't tell. Maybe it didn't matter which. My sister spoke for the first time. "I'll take down the video," she said. "Tonight." I looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," I said. "But you should know that doesn't fix anything. It's just a start." She nodded. "I know." It wasn't everything, but it was more than I had expected. We stood there for a beat longer, the space between us no longer charged, just defined. When we parted, there were no hugs, no dramatic gestures, just nods, restrained and careful, the beginning of something or the end. Time would tell which. I watched them walk away together, their formation altered, their energy subdued. My father's arm brushed my mother's. My brother walked slightly behind. My sister kept glancing at her phone, then putting it away as if breaking a habit she hadn't realized she had. They would talk about this later, I knew. They would reinterpret it in ways that made it easier to digest. They would tell themselves stories that let them sleep at night. I couldn't control that, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to try. Grace found me a few minutes later, still standing in the hallway. "Are they gone?" she asked. I nodded. "You okay?" I considered the question, really considered it. "I think so," I said. "I think I actually am." She studied my face for a moment, then nodded. "Good, because we've got a private event next week and I need you to focus." I laughed. It surprised me, the sound of it, real and unexpected. "I'll be ready," I said. "I know you will," she said. "You always are." She walked away, back to the kitchen, back to the work that didn't care about family drama or viral videos or any of the complicated mess of being human. I stayed a moment longer, letting the quiet settle around me. Then I stepped outside into the night. The cool air felt grounding. The city hummed its usual hum, indifferent to what had just happened, already moving on to the next moment. I realized then that the choice I had made wasn't about power over them. It was about power over myself. I hadn't needed them to understand how strong I was. I hadn't needed them to admit every wrong in perfect language. I hadn't needed their validation or their approval or their finally seeing me. I needed them to understand one thing only, and I had made it clear. I would never make myself smaller again for their comfort. The rest was up to them, and whatever they decided, I would be okay. Because I had Laurel. I had Grace and the team and the work I loved. I had a life I had built with my own hands, one quiet decision at a time. That was enough. That had always been enough. I just hadn't known about it until now. I woke up the morning after the awards without the rush I had expected. No spike of adrenaline. No instinctive reach for my phone to check reactions or replay moments. The quiet surprised me. My body felt loose in a way it hadn't in years. Like I had been carrying something heavy for so long, I had forgotten what it felt like to set it down. I lay there for a minute, listening to the ordinary sounds of a new day starting, and realized my thoughts weren't orbiting anyone else's opinions. There was no urge to explain, no urge to justify. The absence was clean. I moved through the morning slowly, deliberately, doing small things without narrating them to myself. Coffee tasted like coffee, not like fuel for another performance. Sunlight came through the window and stayed where it landed. I didn't replay the night. I didn't rehearse conversations that might come later. For the first time in a long while, my mind wasn't preparing for defense. It felt almost empty. And that emptiness felt like space, rather than loss. Messages trickled in as the day went on, not in a flood, but in a steady, manageable stream. Some were from people who had known me peripherally, colleagues who had once spoken to me cautiously and now wrote with an ease that hadn't been there before. A few were from people who had underestimated me openly, their tone subtly recalibrated, respectful in a way that didn't ask for absolution. There were no dramatic apologies, no confessions, just a shift. I answered some, ignored others, and felt no guilt either way. I wasn't collecting evidence of validation anymore. I didn't need it. As the hours passed, memories surfaced uninvited. Not sharp, not painful, just a present. Times I had been described as low-key, unambitious, practical in a way that meant small. At times I had adjusted my voice, my posture, my presence to make rooms more comfortable. I saw those versions of myself clearly now, not with embarrassment, but with understanding. I hadn't been wrong to be quiet. I had been early. I had been conserving energy for a life that didn't require permission to unfold. My family reached out later in measured ways that reflected the new terrain between us. No jokes, no comparisons, no rankings disguised as concern. Conversations were polite, cautious, almost formal. We spoke about logistics, about neutral topics, about plans that didn't involve proximity. The absence of closeness didn't sting the way it once would have. Distance, I realized, wasn't the same as rejection. Sometimes it was the shape peace took when old dynamics no longer fit. I noticed how little I wanted to perform my freedom. There was no desire to dress differently to signal change, no urge to tell the story again and again to underline the point. The compulsion to be seen had loosened its grip. I chose what felt right because it felt right, not because it proved anything. Silence became a choice rather than a default, and that distinction mattered more than I had expected. The world responded in kind. Opportunities appeared without spectacle. Conversations opened without effort. Respect arrived quietly. Not as a reward, but as a baseline. I didn't savor it. I accepted it the way you accept good weather, aware it might change but not anxious about the sky. Control, I learned, wasn't about orchestrating outcomes. It was about deciding what you were willing to tolerate. Late in the afternoon, I caught my reflection in a window and paused. Not because I looked different, but because I felt different. Lighter, yes, but also steadier. The version of me that once waited for a big moment to make everything make sense felt distant now, like a character I had outgrown. I hadn't needed a dramatic victory to validate my worth. I needed boundaries. I had needed to stop negotiating my dignity. I thought about the word revenge and how easily it gets misunderstood. This hadn't been about humiliation or payback. It hadn't even been about justice in the way people like to frame it. It had been about refusal. Refusing to be flattened into someone else's narrative. Refusing to accept laughter as a measure of truth. Refusing to shrink so others wouldn't have to confront their own discomfort. The change wasn't in my circumstances, it was in my consent. As evening settled in, I felt a calm that didn't depend on what came next. The future didn't need to be outlined. I trusted myself to meet it without armor. The story I had been living under had lost its authority, and in its place was something quieter, sturdier mine. I didn't need to rewrite the past to move forward. I just needed to stop letting it decide the present. I used to think I needed a defining moment, something undeniable and public to prove my value. I see now how small that belief kept me. Value isn't proven, it's protected. Once you stop allowing people to decide it for you, everything else rearranges itself around that choice. The shift doesn't announce itself, it settles in, and life continues. Different in ways that don't ask for applause. If you've ever been the one underestimated in your own family, the one people felt comfortable laughing at because you didn't push back, you're not alone. If you've ever been told you were too quiet, too plain, too much, or not enough, and believed it because the voices were familiar, I see you. Sometimes the most important revenge isn't loud. It's choosing yourself and letting the rest fade into the background.